Sometimes power is right, sometimes power is wrong. Always and everywhere, power defines and is defined by what you should think, do, and say if you wish to flourish. This is the only sure way to know whether you are a dissident or a collaborator. Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. That is a quote from our guest today, Mr. Curtis Yarvin. You can check him out at graymirror.substack.com. Sir, is that the best place to find your work?
That is the best place to find my current work. You can find my the archives of my old blog, which is a very large amount of material, at unqualified-reservations.org. I'm actually also, my Substack is currently, although this will probably change, accessible through the Substack homepage. I'm number 15 in politics. I don't expect I'll stay on that page, but you can find me from there for right now. So yeah, thank you for having me on, Keith, and happy to talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. You wanted to talk about Hans Hermann Hoppe. Was that one of the goals? But I'll let you lead here.
So I'm going to clip this into three separate videos. I want to start off with a discussion on democracy, the God That Failed, a collection of works by Hans Hoppe, and he opens up talking about time preference. What is the importance of time preference?
Well, the thing is, if you know Mises, of course, I expect, I don't know your podcast well, but I expect most of your listeners are libertarians. And it certainly sounds like a libertarian podcast. So if you know the thinking of Mises and Rothbard, the course's concept of time preference. This is really a Misesian kind of core Austrian economic, definition. And essentially, if you have low time preference, you're willing to say there's a test actually that's sometimes given to children, which is a test of time preference, which is, do you want one marshmallow now or two marshmallows in an hour? And the kid who can say, I want two marshmallows in an hour, is more likely to go on to be a nefarious international banker. Or more generally, more likely to succeed in life, or, this thing that we call life these days. Right. So that's time preference. And, time preference, of course, indicates your ability to, sort of prefer the future, to the present, or to discount the future less than others might. Now, one way to understand, the role of time preference in the way you use a piece of property is, let's say you rent a car. In a sense, you don't really care what the condition of that car is in a year or 6 months. You care that it not fall apart while you're driving it and you not get billed for anything. So, no one has ever changed the oil in a rented car ever. And that's what that demonstrates, is it demonstrates the benefits of ownership for the property that is owned. You want to be controlled by someone. If you're a car, just imagine for a second, you're a car, try to kind of compose yourself, think like a car. Do you want to be a rented car? The answer is no, you do not want to be a rented car, because the person who drives the rented car is like, who gives a crap, right? And so that's the experience of being a rented car is a fairly rough one. And when you're basically controlled in a way by people who don't really care what happens to you, they have more and more of an incentive to essentially behave in ways that indicate high time preference being bad. They basically want to, treat you like a car that they just stole and got to joyride in for a couple of hours until the gas ran out and then the key expired or whatever, right? And those cars are not treated very well. And so the analogy of that's interesting is when you say, okay, and this is a very simple comparison that Hoppe makes. Let's compare, and in some ways it doesn't really compare very well to modern situations because of the reality that our system of government is more an oligarchy than a democracy. But let's just compare a very, very pure democracy where you elect a president with absolute power every 4 years compared to electing a king with absolute power every 4 years. So the amount of power over the government, the amount of power over the country that the government has is exactly the same. And actually the structure of the thing is exactly the same. The monarch is just elected, for 4 years versus being hereditary, right? So the monarch who is elected for 4 years, let's say he could be reelected for another 4 years. I don't know where I got that, but the that monarch basically has high time preference because his incentive is to treat the country like a car that he's rented for 4 years. Whereas to the monarch, and especially to the hereditary monarch, the country is much more like this prized family heirloom that has been in the family for centuries and will be in this family for another century. So, who is likely to plant a tree that's going to be a beautiful tree in 50 years? Is it going to be the monarch who's like, I might not live to see this, but I might, and my kid, probably will? Or is it going to be the guy who's only there for 4 years? And so that was a very, seeing that kind of argument, in Hoppe really, like, it sort of transcended libertarianism for me, in a number of ways. But as you see, it's built on this core libertarian concept. Make sense?
Yes. Now, if I am looking at the monarch versus the president, at least I, a member of the proletariat class, have some leverage against the president. He fears that I will vote him out, whereas the monarch can just say, screw me. What is Hoppe's general response to how public opinion can sort of change the behavior of politicians, whether they be presidents, owners or temporary caretakers?
Well, two things. One thing is when you look at public opinion in that sense, you're looking at it as an independent variable. And an independent variable is to say this is an ultimate cause, this is not caused by anything else. Now, in a world where, your sort of definition of public opinion may vary in various ways, and how that's sort of defined is an interesting question. But if we identify a force over which there are levers and there's sort of a clear path of control, or the force changes in a predictable way, we can essentially say, well, this is not an endogenous force. And one of the things that we see certainly in the 20th century is we see that it's generally fairly easy for a government, by controlling, or not just a government, but more broadly a force, by controlling the press that gets into people's heads, can control their heads and does control their heads. And so the result is, if you're in a situation where public opinion is sort of no longer an ultimate cause, then you're just like, that's like saying who's really in charge? The Electoral College, because they elect the president. Well, we all know that the Electoral College is a bunch of doofuses and they have no discretion or whatever. They're just, there to put it on their obituaries or something, right? It's a completely meaningless role. But technically, if you look at the process, yeah, they pick the president. The president is in charge of the military. Therefore, theoretically, they could get together and do a coup, right? We could have, the electoral coup, kind of this kind of, a lot of people are talking coups these days. Like, this is kind of a dark horse that comes out of nowhere, right? The Electoral College strikes. And, turns out they've been in cahoots all along, like they have ties to everything, right? The Rothschilds are in bed with the Electoral College, right? Yeah, I mean, the thing is that to say that the public is in power is not really meaningful unless it sort of actually has that power in any clear sense. And there are many, many indications that it's not only does it not have that power for structural reasons, the structural reasons that it doesn't have that power exist because it doesn't really have enough energy to have power, if that makes sense. And so the thing is that, once you say, well, this is not once public opinion is not an ultimate force, but you look at it empirically, and you're basically like, here are the mechanisms by which public opinion is guided and formed. Oh, which is, of course, a standard perspective of the press today. I mean, everybody reads Walter Lippmann's Public Opinion from 1922 in journalism school, right? They know perfectly well that there's a sort of Neoplatonic kind of guardian of the public thing that, is supposed to be carried on. What we've seen that degrade into, especially in the past few years, or arguably even the past few weeks, is, we're the guardians of the state now. And I'm really going to enjoy it watching, the system turn into any kind of negative, comment about, our president, China Joe, or his wife, Dr. Jill, will turn into harassment, right? It will turn into hate speech. Like if you say Dr. Jill or Dr. Professor, Frau Professor Dr. Jill, right? In some kind of, that's like, I imagine if I did that about a protected class, right? With that same expression, that would be horrifying, right? And so it's really easy to sort of transfer that kind of protection from mockery sort of ultimately to nominal government powers. And at that point, sort of, it's very easy to see, like, the mask is very hard to put back on. So, that's one of the reasons I'm so pro Biden. But, to get back to that, so you're basically saying, okay, this president is accountable, and that's kind of an empirical question that can be stated. Are they in any way accountable? What you would say of the monarch is, how is the absolute monarch accountable, or how do they feel accountable? Number one, these were all religious motherfuckers, right? They were fucking religious, and so they thought that God like existed and was there. They believed in God. And did they consider themselves accountable to God? Yes, absolutely. When you look at like the great, dictators of the 20th century, the Hitlers, the Stalins, the FDRs, they're all atheists. And like, really, I don't, FDR, that's debatable, right? I'm not sure if he was an atheist. But but I would like my looking into it, like he would never come out and say that he was an atheist, but I think Francis Perkins, as Secretary of Labor, was like, yeah, Franklin basically only believed in himself. And as did Stalin and Hitler, there's no question about that, right? And so, that's a sort of accountability that, if you feel accountable, you are accountable. It doesn't have to be like, oh, I'm doing this, but it's not real, so God isn't going to strike me down with a bolt of lightning, so I'm going to do whatever I want. Feeling accountable is entirely enough. The second, thing that, of course, these monarchs is they're woven into this social web of accountability, which is very, very deep. And so, they feel accountable to their families in this kind of very deep feudal kind of way. Do I think that a hereditary monarchy is the absolutely best way to do this? No, I think that there are arguably better ways to do it that are sort of shaped a little more like corporate governance. But that's sort of tricky to transpose that to the sovereign layer. But that's sort of where you're sort of going, I think, in a 21st century absolute monarchy. But of course, again, and so the theory of public opinion holding, sort of the president responsible requires the president to actually be in charge of the government, which is very much not the case. It requires public opinion to be an ultimate cause, which is very much not the case. And so you have this thing which is mainly a cardboard mechanism, and that's why I don't really believe in it.
There was a really interesting part where he says that democracy can actually increase the amount of power that the state has, which at first just blew my mind, but now makes total sense, of course. The explanation is owing to these restrictions regarding entrance into government and the exclusive status of the individual ruler and his family as king and nobles, private government ownership, monarchism, stimulates the development of a clear class consciousness on the part of the governed public and promotes opposition and resistance to any expansion of the government's power to tax. So from that, I get He calls it the elimination of the distinction between the rulers and the ruled. That if you see the monarch as a guy ruling you, you're less likely to grant him power. Whereas if he is an extension of you, Bonapartism or something like that, well, then you're much more likely to let him get away with atrocities, whereas you otherwise wouldn't. Am I reading that accurately, or am
Well,
I wrong?
yeah. I would. I'm not sure I would agree necessarily with Hobbes' sense of causality there. I think Hippolyte Taine, who is a French Victorian writer, put it very well when he said that, democracy issued every man with a ballot, a knapsack, and a musket, and it drafted them into armies as it. And so, I would say that one of the causes of the expansion of the state under, even Bonapartism, which is a sort of interesting transitional form in a number of ways. Certainly, when you see as what another political scientist, Gaetano Mosca, called the political formula, when you see democracy, what you're seeing is sort of not as a kind of political mechanism, but as an ideology. What you're seeing in a democratic ideology is it says there's power flowing from you to the state, right? And it's very easy to say, well, this is actually, once you have the sort of the theory that I am in power over the state, you're like, oh yes, that is the purpose of this wire. This wire is for me to basically exercise power over the state. Well, actually, the current flows in an entirely different fucking direction, right? And so you're sort of hooked by your sense of ownership over it, and that gives it a way to feel ownership over you. And so you sort of have this deeper emotional engagement with it in some ways, and this is why you don't really notice that it's actually much more intrusive than you might think. I mean, for example, there's a great, if we can diverge into history over theory for a moment, for all you Americans out there who believe in the Declaration of Independence, lovely document, of course, but there's a great American historian and statesman whose work is absolutely worth reading, whose name is Thomas Hutchinson. He actually had his house burned by a leftist mob in the 1770s, I believe, 70s or 60s. He was one of the last royal governors of Massachusetts, and he wrote this interesting piece, which is his responses to the Declaration of Independence. And so basically the Declaration of Independence, if you've read it, it's a very high-tone document. It's very gassy. It's full of very large bubbles of very, very hot and powerful wind, right? And what Hutchinson does, which is very clever, is he basically takes these kind of bubbles of wind, and he's like, in this letter to a friend of his back in England, he's like, let me explain to you what these people actually mean by this stuff, because I'll bet you're baffled. And so essentially he goes through each of these, examples of purported tyranny, and where the Declaration is like, he has obstructed useful schemes to, improve the commerce of our nation or of our colony or whatever, because this is all Massachusetts stuff. He's like, yeah, when I got here, they had this paper money thing that they were doing, total scam. I shut it all down. and, or, he's like, and then he's like, oh, and they have sent swarms of officers here to eat out our living. And he's like, well, like the only swarm of officers I know of, since I'm sure they're referring to this, is, as you may know, we actually started enforcing the anti-smuggling laws. So we needed like 20 guys. So we have like 20 guys for like 3 million people, right? And like, this is like a swarm, right? And so the, it's really like, it's actually like he knows that what he's doing is humorous, and he intends to exploit that, but as sort of a true American, a true conservative, you look at this conflict and you're like, wait a second, I'm supposed to be on the other side of this conflict, and then you're like, wait a second, which of these sides of this conflict is left and which one is right? Why am I on the left? What am I doing over here on the left? Like what? I'm with like the mob violence. I mean, like you're reading this guy. He's a gentleman. He's wonderful. He's erudite. He's very civilized, and he had his house burned down by a Black Lives Matter mob, essentially, or the 18th century equivalent, right? Whose side are you on here? And I would put that out there for all the flag wavers. I love the flag, of course, but.
Now, Hoppe talks about this is interesting when it comes to BLM or Antifa. Hoppe talks about the need for Democratic politicians to appeal to the ignorant, to appeal to the envious and short-sighted voters. This almost changes the character of the nation because the leaders who seek to be on top need to appeal to these sorts of things. They also appeal to pressure groups and interest groups who have concentrated benefits. It really matters if Raytheon gets that next contract, but for you or I don't want them to. But how much time am I going to spend, when it's going to cost me probably $4 over the next year, and it's going to get them, $10 billion. So talks about.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree with all these Hoppian critiques. The thing that, in a way, I've learned since I was first exposed to these is that Hoppe is really, Hoppe is a theorist, right? And he's absolutely right here, but he's critiquing a system which everyone thinks exists, which only used to exist. And so what he's critiquing is essentially, how in France they number their republics. This is really great. Whenever they have a regime change, they go from like the Third Republic to the Fourth Republic.
Yes.
It's so cool, right? And then they like skip Vichy because that's not a republic at all or something. They really should be on number 6, but they instead they were just so pissed off that they put a gap in the number, right? Which
Vichy was a mulligan. Yeah, I know.
It was a mulligan, right? I feel totally illegitimate, right? But you know what, you guys, you're French, whatever, you can do it, right? So, in any case, essentially, when you read Hoppe's critique as a critique of the American system, what he's critiquing is the Third Republic and not the Fourth Republic, because he's critiquing the pre-FDR Republic rather than New Deal America. So one of the things that you'll find that, essentially for, just a quick preview of my version of post-revolutionary American history is that you basically have 3 American presidents who are pretty close to being absolute monarchs. You have Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. And each of those regimes, which is originally essentially a personal regime where the dude can just do whatever the fuck he wants, sort of ossifies into this very process-oriented bureaucracy. So, for example, kind of America's real constitution in the post-war era is something you may have heard of as a libertarian called the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946. The APA essentially dictates kind of how the government runs and takes it out of the hands of sort of the despised politicians. You might have noticed, one thing I always point out to people just that you just can't explain without going off the map is you have this interesting situation where you have these 2 words, politics and democracy. And one of them is super good and the other one is super bad, but they mean the same thing. So, if you said you were going to democratize U.S. foreign policy, that would be good. But if you were going to politicize it, that would be very bad, right? So, but how do you have democracy without politics? That's like something Kim Jong-un would come up with. Yes, of course we have no politics here, but we're completely, we're the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, right? They put the name in 3 times, right, just to make sure. And the fourth is just geography, right? So they're democratic, but there doesn't seem to be any politics. So that's an interesting 20th century pattern, is that, and then we notice that, wow, it doesn't, either Donald Trump actually didn't have any power over the deep state, or, he had power but didn't use it. That's really weird. And so sort of by a number of factors, you realize that essentially these same critiques of democracy that Hoppe uttered were uttered by leading progressive intellectuals in the early 20th century. You can find them in Woodrow Wilson. You can find them in Walter Lippmann. You can find them in basically Henry Adams, Charles Francis Adams. You can find them basically going back all the way to the liberal Republicans of the late 19th century. Right. So, this critique of democracy is actually extremely old. And when you discover it in the present day, it's like you're robbing a tomb that's already been robbed. Right. Because essentially what was decided, the reason we have this difference between, this kind of deep spiritual thing, which is democracy, which is the people rule, man, to like the mechanism by which the people rule politics is actually broken and stupid and nobody believes in it and it's not really in charge of anything. The way we got there is through sort of the way that the New Deal was built up and the way FDR's kind of personal regime of the New Deal turns into the bureaucratic oligarchy that, survives after FDR's death. Which is what we have now. And this bureaucratic oligarchy does essentially everything possible to separate itself from, democracy in the literal sense of the word, but certainly politics. Like, let's look at, the classic progressive era agency, the Federal Reserve. It's an independent agency. What does that even mean? Where is that in the Constitution, right? And what does independent mean? Independent means it should be as separate from any kind of political accountability as possible, and that is good, right? And because you basically have a government that's entirely built on the principle that democracy is bad, that politics is bad. The whole system of the executive branch and the whole way the New Deal is built up is essentially built as this massive buffer against democracy because it's built as a buffer against politics, right? And this is why, when, things like the what was it? The credit. I'm trying to remember the name. The Elizabeth Warren Bureau was created. The Credit Protection Bureau or whatever. They're basically like, we're going to give it its own sorts of revenue from the agencies, from the companies it regulates, so that there's absolutely no way to pull any strings, over this. And so basically, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, right? CFPB, and so they create this CFPB, and they're basically like, we have to make this organization as much like George III as possible, right? So you've come full fucking circle, right? Instead of one George III, you have this massive oligarchy of tiny George IIIs. Not that George III was ever actually an absolute monarch, but that's a different conversation. But you've vastly magnified the problem in many different ways. Worse, the other thing, Hoppe talks about, it's a long time since I've read this book, but Hoppe talks about this somewhere, I'm sure, which is that the incentive of all these petty kings, even if their power adds up to the power of one big king, their incentive is very different because they have no ownership at all. It's not even, they didn't even rent the car, right? There's zero accountability for these people by design, because the only way to give them accountability is to sort of return to Third Republic kind of Gilded Age robber baron kleptocracy, which everyone hates. And so, and yellow journalism and robber baron kleptocracy, that's the Third Republic for you. Those things are real. And so instead, we sort of need this platonic guardian class, which forms public opinion rather than that bad social media with all its misinformation, but the misinformation, huge problem. So, this is our sort of real republic. So Hoppe's critiques of sort of the old abstraction are interesting, but those critiques in a way have already been acted on. And they were acted on in a way that created this thing that is sort of pretends to be the Third Republic and is actually kind of a little bit more like the Soviet Union. And if you go to Europe, you see kind of the next stage of it, really, which is that the European Commission is just accountable to no one. The European Parliament is a joke and a clown show. And it becomes like a California election, essentially, where politics just disappears. And so, because it has just no power at all over the real government, and it stops being able to pretend, and its last spasms turn into these sort of weird clown shows that aren't really connected to reality at all, which I think are very, very interesting and informative. And I'm looking forward to a very different kind of clown show for the next 4 years. I think that I mean, you can't have a variety show without variety, right? And what is the presidency now? And so this is going to be fun. This is going to be cool. This is going to be interesting. I'm psyched. And all right, next question. If that answered your last one.
Yeah, so let's just close out on democracy, the god that failed. Is there any main thing that I missed or main point you got from the book that
I
you
think
wanted
what blew
to
my
enter into
mind
this
about
summer?
I think what blew my mind about that book is that previously I had seen nations in this very kind of Lockean Anglo-American sense. And I hadn't really understood the world of, the kind of classical or, classical international law or the natural law of nations best understood, and you can just go and read Vattel's Law of Nations. It's the textbook the founders used. It's the classic 18th century textbook, really simple and well written. And I sort of had no knowledge of this world, or this whole, like, all of 20th century international law is completely fake, basically. It's fake and lame. And when you go back and read, what Hoppe shows you is this world where you're like, hey, actually, when I look at these monarchies, I can identify them as essentially very much like competing corporations. There happen to be family-owned corporations, and they're competing in a world in which, ideally, in the old sort of world, there's nothing above them. International law, basically, before the 20th century, wasn't law over a nation. It was basically the set of rules by which nations themselves decided how to behave. But the idea of nations being governed by a higher power, which is, the international community, which is essentially sort of the Anglo-American Empire, was a completely, like, it's a contradiction of sort of all the principles of the old system, right? And so, and of course, that's pretty hard to miss these days, right? The effects of that, but it's a sort of an effect at a deep level of principle. And so this idea that essentially a country could be owned, that it could be understood as a piece of property, was essentially new to me. Moreover, the thing that you realize, if the king owns the country and therefore uses his low time preference to sort of nurture and defend it as a king should, then in a sense he's owning not just the land, he's owning the people, right? And so those people are essentially assets on his books, whether you like it or not, which is very different from the sort of traditional classical liberal sense that we're all familiar with as libertarians. You're suddenly like, wow, it's not that it's the purpose of the government to help the people do to help the people enjoy themselves. The government actually owns the people, which makes the people assets of the government, which means that one of the purposes of the government is to, watch not just the land flourish, not just the geographical territory, but actually the population should flourish as well. I don't know if you've driven around, America today and like looked out the window, but I think unless outside of a few very affluent areas, it would be very hard to make the case that what you're looking at here is a flourishing country, right? And so, you're basically like, from the perspective of, a Frederick the Great or someone, the government of the United States gets a very poor grade. From the perspective of Premier Xi or, the government gets a very poor grade. From the perspective of Singapore, the government gets a very poor grade, right? And so you're basically you're looking at this thing and you're like, this is getting a poor grade. And I think that one of the things libertarians should, remember is they're looking at this system and, when you judge, like when libertarians think about government, they should and power and the uses of power, what they should remember is that they're seeing these things at their worst because they're seeing these mechanisms, for example, say tariffs. When you think about tariffs, you think about them being used by a basically corrupt government in a basically corrupt way for basically corrupt reasons. And so when you see a lot of this, and anyone who's looked at say the use of tariffs in say Latin America in the post-war 20th century, anyone sort of familiar with that history is going to be like, well, this is basically a very disgusting instrument because I only see it being used for disgusting things in disgusting ways. And my answer to those people would be, the only problem with what you're doing here is your sample is not well distributed because you're looking at a very narrow piece of history that has the same problem for very narrow reasons. And what you should think about is not how this tool was used by Brazil in the 1970s, but by how it was used by Elizabeth I in the 1580s, right? Because those people were real too, and they're just as real as the 1980s, man, and that's something that I think a lot of libertarians forget. They sort of privilege the present and the near present above all of history, and that's another habit that Professor Hoppe helped break me of. So thank you, Professor Hoppe, because that was really reading that book, as for a lot of people, was very formative for me.